Hi there, this is Dennis Velco with OutBüro. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of OutBüro Voices, where we bring you interesting conversations with LGBTQ professionals, entrepreneurs, and leaders around the world. Today, we are again speaking with Bruce Knotts from the UU, that is Unitarian Universalist Association, where he is the liaison to the United Nations. If you didn't see our recap yet on the UU faith and what it is, be sure to check right up here, click there, go ahead and finish this, then either come back or give that a right click and open it up in the next window so you can understand what Unitarian Universalist is and check it out further. Alrighty, Bruce, thank you so much for coming back and furthering the conversation. You have a very interesting role. So tell us, what is the liaison to the UN? What kind of things do you do?
So, yes, this is something a lot of people don't know about, but most religions have an office at the United Nations, and basically we are trying to advocate for our values and get our values into United Nations policy. So my office is right next to the Presbyterian office, which is right next to the Methodist office. The Catholics are there, Jewish organizations, everybody is pretty much there. I came to the job with a mission, and I told people in the interview, I said, if you take me as your director for this office, I am going to follow a very aggressive LGBT advocacy policy. And I was told by the then UUA President, Reverend Bill Sinkford, who, by the way, was our first African-American president of the denomination, he said, Bruce, if you don't do that, you will have to answer to me. So he gave me a real push and said, go out there and really advocate strongly for LGBT rights. So that's what I did. That was 2008. Thank you. 2008, there wasn't much discussion about LGBT rights at the UN. Hardly at all. The only time it sort of happened was in March during the Commission on the Status of Women, but the rest of the year, really no discussion at all. And I just kept bringing it up again and again. We were preparing for a human rights conference in Paris to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as they were talking about human rights universally, they were talking about the Dalits in India, the Roma in Europe, and not a word about LGBT. So I kept raising my hand and I said, what about LGBT rights? And they said, okay, we'll take that under advisement. And so week after week at these meetings, I would raise my hand and said, what are we going to do for LGBT rights? And I just was persistent. I wouldn't let it go. And between the meetings, I was lobbying the other delegates and making sure that I started building a coalition. And finally, I was given a workshop, and it was the first ever workshop in the 60-year history of these conferences where LGBT rights were discussed. And I had several speakers from Europe, from Africa, from different parts of the world talking about LGBT rights.
So, wait, dude,
Okay.
let's pause for a moment.
Okay.
So in the 60 years of these conferences, this literally was the first time that LGBT rights in any form or fashion was officially discussed by the United Nations?
The conferences I'm talking about are actually civil society and United Nations conferences together. And in the 60-year history of those conferences where civil society and the UN gets together to discuss things, it's the first time that LGBT rights was ever discussed. And that was in 2008. If you go back to the Beijing Women's Conference, and in several women's conferences, lesbian rights were discussed somewhat, kind of as an afterthought, but there was, so I don't want to say that there was no mention of LGBT rights at all at the UN, but it mostly was in the context of women's rights. And so at women's conferences, you would hear some discussion of lesbian rights. Okay. But other than that, my intervention in 2008 was the first time all of the letters were discussed, all LGBT aspects were discussed. And France, of course, was the host of this conference. And the government of France said that they were going to present a draft resolution at the UN General Assembly that year to end violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And in my workshop, there were several people there from Norway, from different countries that said, yes, we're going to support this. And so we actually turned the workshop into a planning session, how we were going to do this. Later, I was at a larger breakout session, and there were people there from the Vatican at that session. And there was this Monsignor from the Vatican. He was a big high-level official, and he grabbed me and he pulled me into a corner and kind of scared me. And he didn't want people to hear what he was going to say. And what he said to me, he says, I just want to let you know I'm gay and I support everything you're doing. I said, oh, okay.
Wow.
That was a surprise. And then when I was at Charles de Gaulle Airport on the way home, there were a bunch of Catholic nuns from Boston, and they were loud. They were all talking really loud. And they called out across the room there and said, hey, are you the guy who was talking about gay rights at the conference? And I said, yeah. And they said, good on you. Keep up the good work. I go, nuns, who knew, you know?
Wow.
So I felt very empowered by that. On December 18th, I think it was, at the UN General Assembly, this draft resolution was presented. 66 countries endorsed it. We decided in the end it was better not to have France introduce the resolution. We thought it would be better to have a nation in the global south introduce it, so it was actually Argentina. But 66 nations signed it. Most of the nations in the Western Hemisphere, with the notable exception of the United States, which did not sign it. This was under George Bush at the time. And Cuba also did not sign it. And most of the nations in the European Union signed it. So 66 countries. Then Barack Obama, of course, was sworn in as president in January 2009, and he endorsed this draft resolution. And we started getting all kinds of headway at the UN. The Human Rights Council had 2 resolutions introduced by South Africa, because we thought it was very important to get initiatives from the global south, because there's this trope out there that basically saying that we have a homosexual agenda in the North and in European and North American societies. And we're trying to foist this on the people of Africa or other countries. And so we felt it was strategically important to make sure that the initiatives on LGBT rights come from countries in the global south, which is what we were able to achieve. So the Human Rights Council, said that there should be no more discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and no more violence. The first documented report of the United Nations on sexual orientation and gender identity on violence and discrimination was done by the Human Rights Council in 2010. So we were on a roll. We were really doing quite good. Now the United Nations has policies, procedures, and programs in all of its 108 agencies that benefit LGBT people around the world, including United Nations employees and their same-sex families.
Wonderful.
Partners, they now have benefits which they didn't have in the past.
Okay, wonderful. All of that snowballed from a very persistent Unitarian Universalist sitting right there. Amazing! Wow, what a contribution you have created. And yes, I know it wasn't all. It took a lot of people and a lot of players, and I certainly acknowledge that, just like all movement on all rights issues do. Yeah, folks, you're looking at the person right now on the screen named Bruce Nutt, who was instrumental in creating the LGBT rights initiative, issues, policies, importance of LGBT rights around the globe at the United Nations. Freaking amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Charlie Clemens, who at the time was the head of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, he said, Bruce, you were the right person in the right place at the right time. And I'm a Californian. I used to go surfing, and anybody that has ever gone surfing knows it's all about catching the wave, catching it right at the right moment so you can ride down. And so I was there. I was there at the right time in the right place and was able to catch that wave. And that wave lasted, I would say, until about 2012. In 2012, the religious right, which hates the UN, started showing up at the UN and opposing our initiatives. And so things began to slow down a bit. We haven't lost any ground, but of course now we have an administration. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has a commission, and he's about ready to roll out the findings of this commission to advocate unalienable and biblical right. And this will take us back. This will threaten LGBT rights and women's rights, and it will go back to racist policies. He wants to go back to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence and biblical right. And human rights has evolved over all of these years. It's why we are working at the United Nations, because we're able to evolve human rights forward. So we're facing some very stiff opposition from this administration, also from the religious right. I would say we're not making any particular progress at the moment, but we're holding our own, and we're making sure we're not losing any ground. But it was a lot of fun. We were riding the wave from 2008 to 2012, but now it's much tougher work defending the gains that we've made.
Pardon me. That's unfortunate. That we're at the whims of political players that come into power for the period that they are, and folks out there. That's why it is so important for you to get out and vote and ensure that your message is heard. Do not be complacent. Take all of your neighbors and friends, load them up in your vehicles, take them to vote. If they have to do vote by mail, make sure that they're doing it, because when we do vote, the persons in power around the globe at the individual country levels make a huge difference at the UN level. And what you're hearing is, because even the who is in power in the United States at the presidential level, and the messages of hope or the messages of hate and chaotic confusion and despair can influence how policies and so forth are treated at the United Nations level, is what you're hearing. And so all of these struggles and all of the wins that we gain, also you just can't go, oh, we won that, now let's go back and sit on our laurels. No. Like, for analogy with the Supreme Court decision on saying that, or making the case that it's now illegal in the United States, and all states and all territories, that discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is now illegal in the workplace. Well, okay, great. But that doesn't mean, that tomorrow all places are welcoming. You still have those long held, learned folks. People are not born with homophobia. People are not born with racism. Okay, that is taught and learned. So it can be unlearned, but it takes a lot of time. And so work that folks like Bruce and everyone who is working on LGBT rights, gender rights, racial rights, and so forth, it takes that work. But once you make that gain and you win that, the work is not over. You have to fight like tooth and nail to keep it. So very interesting. Well, I know you have another meeting here coming up. Want to respect your time. So Bruce, if you could, is there any kind of final words for this particular episode that you would like to leave us with? Is there something that we can do? I just kind of throwing something out there at the last moment. But is there something we can do? Is there?
I want to validate what you've just said, because it is so very important. Those of us, I'm married, those of us that are married, I mean, when we got marriage equality, we just thought we'd arrived, everything was wonderful. And what really broke my heart was that marriage equality disbanded and just disappeared. And they had such a deep infrastructure. They had a lot of employees, a lot of dynamism, and they should not have closed because the work is never done. Because it's not just about marriage, it's about the workplace, it's about where we live. And it's not just in the United States, it's our brothers and sisters around the world that are suffering horribly because of terrible oppressive policies. And I tell my students, I teach at NYU sometimes, and I tell my students that homophobia, transphobia, racism, these are chronic illnesses and it needs daily medication. You can't cure these things. You need to keep taking your medication every day. And we need to work on these human rights issues every day. And voting is absolutely crucial. And we need to be smart and we need to vote in all of the elections, not just the presidential election, but local elections and state elections and cities and school boards and whatever is being coming up. We need to vote in all of those elections because every one of those elections matter. And they all filter in at the end at the United Nations. But it's everybody voting everywhere and taking an active interest in human rights for all of us.
I could not agree more. And, that is such a great point is yes, every single elected office matters because they could be affecting your children. They could be affecting your local ordinances. And all of that does filter up to your country's top level position, prime minister, president, and so forth. And then, as you just clearly indicated, all of that then filters up to the United Nations. And so, this has been very enlightening. Again, folks, check out the links below if you would like to learn more about the Unitarian Universalist faith. That is at uua.org. And Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. And make sure you do check out the link here if you'd like to also listen to that first episode that we have. And Bruce, at any time you'd like to chat about what's going on at the United Nations or issues going on around the world that you believe that the audience here should be very well aware of, I would love to have you back. Just reach out and let me know at any time that you would like to come back and, let's have a chat.
Thanks, will do.
Awesome. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Again, this is Dennis Velco with OutBüro. That is at OUTBURO.com. Bye-bye.